You might be smarter, but they've been playing this game for so long. They know how to divide working class white people and working class black people and pit them against each other. Because when you have a problem, you got a problem. But when you got two problems, you put them together and let them solve each other. Hire one half of the poor to kill the other half. This is the thing that we're dealing with. So instead of actually dealing with the problems, it's not only black people that have been lied to about their history. Where in white people's American history is who fought for all the fact that there wouldn't be 10-year-olds working in a slave labor camp, right? Making a steel mill shit for the robber barons of this world. Who fought so that you would have an 8-hour day, and anytime somebody made you work more than that, you had to get paid? Who fought to say that your mom couldn't be fired for being pregnant? Is that filed under the commie history section of America? No, those are workers' rights, and those affected everybody. The problem is that they never were applied across the board towards people of all races and cultures. But it still stands that those workers still got fucked out of their jobs. They were eventually replaced, and they were eventually abandoned by the system. So when you look at it from that perspective, without doing the historical analysis and putting it into context, you'll always be opposed to one another without realizing that you have more in common than you do apart. And that's the problem, that people don't recognize that commonality, because we can talk about how racism is real, but race is a social construct. We're one human race, right? We have different phenotypes based upon where we're from. Sure. You know what I mean? There's less sun up there, more sun here. You know what I mean? People have a different hair based on the weather or the area, the temperament where they live.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's necessary to point out. We're one human race, and people have used the idea of that because they never want to discuss classism. That's the last thing on their fucking agenda.
I mean, we don't even need classism with racism. When you got racist white people that simply think they're better than you.
Because it protects class.
That's more convenient.
It makes people that are poor and being taken advantage of by the system think just for a second, man, at least I'm not bad.
Exactly.
Yes. But what about them poor white niggas that I call Trump supporters down south who are white, poor as shit, but still think they better than you?
Here's an interesting thing. If you ever look up Fred Hampton on YouTube, I'm not talking to you, I'm saying the people at home, you'll find he's in a meeting. And I saw this very interesting meeting. It was a movie called, I think it was Bastards of the Party, or it was a movie about the Black Panthers. And it showed how Fred Hampton had gone into these communities where there were poor working class white people. And one of the interesting things I saw is, to your point, there was a white guy that was standing next to Fred, and he had a black vest. And on the side of his vest was a Confederate flag, right? Mind you, Fred is a Black Panther, one of the most prominent ones. He wasn't railing on that. For a second, he said, wait a minute, we can deal with these issues. But as white working class people that are being taken advantage of by the same corporations that are turning a blind eye and taking advantage of to us, if we unite, then we find more commonality amongst ourselves. I'm not saying that we'll ignore that. We can have a cultural discussion and a debate, which you'll probably lose, about the origin of that flag, about what it actually means and what it signifies, right? But if we unite as working class people, we can force them to come to terms now with us, right? Because we have a unified front where you can't say, oh, I'm going to replace the white worker with the black worker when he goes on strike. No, I won't strike because that's my brother in arms, and I won't allow you to use me to pit against him. In the other way, I won't allow these people to be the brunt of a system being tested on me.
When we look around and we see today in our politics a rich white man telling working class white people that their problem is brown people, we need to understand the historical pedigree of that. That is symbolic of the entire history of race and class politics in America. The history of rich white people telling working class and poor white people that their problem are black and brown people. So beginning in the 1600s, that is what happens. Prior to about 1670 or so, there was no such thing as the white race, at least not recognized as such, called as such. That is not what people of European descent were when they were in Europe. They were English, they were Irish, they were Scottish, they were whatever they were. They were not white. Only in the colonies do we become white, and for a very specific reason, because in those early years of the colonial period, where you had white indentured servants, one level above enslaved themselves, and you had African-descended folks, some of them enslaved for life, others indentured servants also in the earliest years of the colonies. Those people would often see their interests as being common. They all realized that they were being screwed over by the same landowners, the same elite. They fomented various rebellions like Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, others as well. And as a result, the elite in the colonies realized that they had to figure out a way to get the other folks from Europe on their team. So they created this mentality that said, you're now a member of the white race. You're on our team. You're wearing our uniform. Now you're at the end of the bench. You may not get in the game, but you're on our team, you see. So then they start putting white folks, now called, on the slave patrols, right? Didn't really give them any land or any real power except the power to control people of color, which is why folks of color say, and they are right, that modern policing traces to the system of slave patrols and slavery. And we have to be clear on that because that's the history, right? So whiteness was created to divide and conquer, to create the notion that even though you might not have much, at least you're not black, at least you're not indigenous, at least you're not Mexican, at least you're not Chinese working on the railroads to build the transcontinental economy. You may not have much, but at least you have, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, the psychological wage of whiteness. And it's a trick that was played during the Civil War era on my people in the South, right? Rich folk, landowners in the South telling poor white folks who didn't own anything that they got to go out and fight to preserve the rich man's property in human beings. Fascinating. Why would you do that? Why would I go fight for your property? Well, because you told me that if I don't, these slaves are going to take my job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. If you got to charge $1 a day and you can make them work for free because you own them, guess who got the gig, Jack? Not you. So in fact, the system of enslavement was in the long run against the class interest of working class white folks, but they got suckered. Same thing happened in the union movement. You had white labor union folks who didn't want black and brown bodies in their union because it would reduce the professionalism of the craft. No, fool, it'll double the size of your union. And then when you go out on strike, they can't replace your happy ass with the brown folk that you didn't want next to you in the first place. Because when they do replace you with them, then you will blame them, not the elite. See how that works? It's a trick. And it has worked for hundreds of years. It is working on some folk right now. And it is our job to resist that with every fiber of our being.
Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed once in Birmingham. And he said he turned to his white jailer and said, you know, you and I aren't that much different. There's not a huge gulf that separates us. You don't have control over the institutions which govern your life. You don't have a basic say-so in American democracy. And yet, the dominant forces of white supremacy manipulate you into believing you are my enemy. And unfortunately, that's a strategy that hasn't changed from Nixon and before Nixon, George McGovern before that on the Democratic side and the Republican side. And so I think what we have to tell our white brothers who are working class, blue-collar cats is that you're in the same boat as most African American people, as most Latino people. You suffer from the economy equally. If you allow elite white politicians to manipulate you into believing that your real enemy is a black guy who works alongside you in a factory where you're both inhaling toxic chemicals that will lead both of you to die early, as opposed to this elite figure in the American political echelon or corporate structure that is living off of your anxiety about this black guy, you're going down to defeat. And I think what we have to say to them is that we're in a larger same boat in terms of class, in terms of some of the cultural values we share, even if we have different racial approaches to that. It's interesting that we have a language and vocabulary for race in America, but we don't have much of a vocabulary for class. And many people can't make that distinction. Black or white, well, what about poor or rich? What about health care or non-health care? And when we begin to break the numbers down, the number of white people on welfare, the number of white people who are poor, the number of white people who don't control the government in ways they'd like to see, and the number of white people who say, you know what, you want affirmative action, but why should your kid get an advantage over me? Or you want reparations, why should your kid get an advantage over mine when we don't have any economic wherewithal either? And I say to them, look, it's not either or. What's amazing is that right-wing conservatives become Marxists when it comes to the issue of race. Aha, you better watch out because those black people are taking money out of your pocket.
The coal company would see that the body of a dead miner was delivered to the front porch of his home on a wooden stretcher. If the accident was an explosion that took his life, his body parts would be delivered in a bucket. At that point, the widow had 24 hours to find a replacement to fill the job left vacant by her husband's death. If she had a son over the age of 14, he had to go. If she couldn't find a replacement, she would be evicted from the home she rented from the coal company. In the 1800s, Irish Catholic miners living in the coal regions of Pennsylvania were not only required to pay high rents in the company-owned houses, they were required to buy all their goods from the company store at inflated prices. Oftentimes, men were paid in company scrip that could only be used at the company store and to pay their rent. After a hard week, a miner would often end up owing more to the company than he was paid. They had fled Ireland to escape famine and religious persecution, only to find themselves in equally desperate circumstances. The experience of the Irish Catholic miner in the 1800s in the Pennsylvania coal regions was akin to slavery. A proud people, they stood up to the most influential men in America at that time, the powerful magnates of the coal and rail companies. Their actions in standing up gave birth to unionized labor and the protection of the working class in the United States. The owners of the coal and rail companies wanted to break the unions. Soon the men who had been union leaders would find themselves facing various criminal charges, including murder. Many to this day believe the leaders were framed in an attempt to break the union. The accused were commonly referred to as Molly Maguires, thought to be an underground terrorist group. No evidence exists that any such group operated at the time, and that the label was part of the conspiracy to frame them. In the trying of these men, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania abandoned its duties to see that due process was afforded to the accused. The only thing the state provided was a courtroom and a hangman. The men were arrested by the company-owned security force. They were put on trial. The prosecutors were attorneys hired by the coal and rail companies. No Irish Americans were permitted on the jury. The jury was comprised mostly of German Americans who could barely speak or understand English. Today, as historians and scholars look over the transcripts of the trials, it is widely agreed that no evidence was presented linking these men to any of the crimes they were accused of. It is thought to be one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in the history of the United States. More than 20 men who stood up for the rights of their fellow workers would be silenced by the coal companies at the end of a rope. As Alexander Campbell was being led from his cell on execution day, he rubbed his hand on the dirty floor and placed his handprint on the cell wall, proclaiming it would remain forever as a testament to his innocence. Efforts over the last 135 years have been made to wash it away, to plaster and paint over it. That section of the wall has even been replaced, and yet the handprint always returns. In 1975, scientists from Wilkes College studied and examined the handprint in depth and concluded that it defies all earthly explanation. Its chemical makeup and mere existence cannot be scientifically explained. From somewhere behind the radio, with the music of Johnny X, I'm the American Storyteller.